All right. So the first thing that we're going to talk about are some properties that are things you might already know, but in order to justify solving equations later, we need to know the properties that tell us this is truly the case. Okay? So we have three properties right off the bat. The first one is the identity property of multiplication. Okay, we talked a little bit about identity property of addition, and remember we said identity is, if you think of it in terms of people, that is who you are. You can change what you're wearing, you can change your hair, you can put makeup on. It doesn't change the identity. So if we want to do something to a number that doesn't change it, we want to multiply something, the only thing that's not going to change our number is multiplying by 1. So the identity property says if we do any number, any real number, n, times 1, we get the same number. It does not change what we started with. Okay? So remember, it will not change. Okay? So the identity for multiplication is 1. The identity for addition is 0, because adding 0 won't change it. Now, speaking of 0, we have a property involving that. It is the multiplication property of 0. And this property tells us if we multiply any number, any real number, times 0, what do we get as a result? Yes, we get 0. Okay, so it could be a fraction, a decimal, a positive, a negative. If you multiply anything times 0, you get 0. Okay, and the third property is the multiplication property of -1. Which tells us multiplying any real number by -1 gives us the opposite of that number. So if n is positive, it would make it -n. Now the reason we don't want to say, oh, it makes everything negative, is because if it already were negative and you multiply it by -1, it's going to change it to positive. So it just switches it to the opposite sign of what it started with. So it changes it to the opposite sign. Yes?
My teacher last year, she was teaching us, and she said that if you can't get the, if you can't get the,
if it comes to you, you can tell us. All right. So what you're going to write down next are the rules. And in the book, they separate this out for multiplication and division. They have the multiplication rules and the division rules. But really, the rules for multiplication and division are the same. It just depends on if both numbers are negative or positive, or if you have one of each. So the first thing we're going to write down is what we do if we have the same signs. All right, these are your rules. So same signs, two positives, 4, 2 negatives, multiplied or divided, okay, end up giving us a positive result. So if your signs are the same, now it's weird because once you throw the negatives in there, people start messing up on 2 positives. Remember, you've been doing 2 positives from the time you learned how to multiply and divide. So 2 positives results in a positive no matter what. Okay, it's the 2 negatives that, think of 1 negative changes the other. It's kind of like the opposite. Okay, so same signs, that would look like -3 times -2, which would give us +6. And in division, that would look like -8 divided by -4. Now you could do that in the form of a fraction, or you could do it horizontally, but the point remains the same. If you have 2 negatives, you're going to end up with a positive. All right, now the other rule is when you have opposite signs, one positive, one negative. And it doesn't really matter what the order is. Positive can come first or second, but if you have one of each, no matter what, that is going to result in a negative on your final answer. So for multiplication, what that may look like is 7 times -2, which is -14. Or -12 divided by 3 would be -4. And again, this could be written horizontally and it would mean the same thing. So if I did -12 divided by 3, that is the same as this. That's still going to give me a negative result. Okay. All right. So in this section, you're going to do some evaluating just like we've done in the others. We're going to evaluate negative C times D when C is -8 and D is -7. Okay. Think of it this way: erase and replace, plug and chug. You know, you're going to take out the variables. I would recommend in this instance, now that they're throwing the negatives in, that you take out the variables and put in a set of parentheses for each variable. That's going to allow you to see how many negatives you're actually dealing with. So this negative in front is really kind of saying the opposite of whatever C times D is. But if I use parentheses for C and D, I have -8 times -7. So multiplying the two of these, my rule tells me that the 2 negatives together give me a positive, right? So this is the opposite of 56, which is just negative 56. Okay. Now another way that you could look at this, and this will work if you've got one expression, no addition or subtraction in there, but if you've got multiplication and division all in one clump, you can look at how many negatives you have. If it's an even number, okay, every pair cancels each other out. If you have an odd number, the oddball, the extra one, is going to turn your result negative. But that's only with multiplication and division. So here, do you notice that I've got 3 of them? Counting up those 3 tells me my final answer should be negative because 3 is odd, right? Okay, now one more example using the same values of C and D. Okay, so I have negative 2 times negative 3 times CD. So plugging in with parentheses, I have negative 2 times negative 3 times negative 8 times negative 7. If you count up your negatives, what should your final result be, positive or negative? Positive, because the pairs cancel each other out. So I know my answer is going to be positive, so all I really have to do is multiply 2 times 3 times 8 times 7. Okay. Now just a little tip here. You can multiply those in any order you want because multiplication is commutative, meaning I can reverse order and it's still the same result. And it's associative, meaning I can group it and do any 2 first that I want. So if something makes it easier for you, by all means do that. But bottom line is, if I multiply these 4 together, I get 336, and my signs, like we said, should end up positive.